Welcome to the Parenting Plan Handbook, Video 2. Today we'll be talking about how to design your residential schedule, which involves sharing your children across 2 homes. I'm Karen Bonnell, and this is my co-author, Felicia Malsby-Soleil.
Thanks, Karen. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the myriad of considerations that you need to think about when designing your parenting plan, specifically your day-to-day schedule, your school schedule, the summer schedule, and we're also going to be looking at things like school breaks, holidays, and special occasions. We're also going to be sharing with you things to keep in mind when you have children between the ages of birth and 3 years old, and then of course teenagers who often have different things that they want to say about their parenting plan. Isn't that right, Karen?
Oh my goodness, that, and we're even going to touch on young adults. But Felicia, what I know about this particular time as you sit down to do a residential schedule is that everything feels like a loss. It's one thing to end an intimate partnership. It's another thing to think about not being with your children every day, tucking them in, helping them get up in the morning and making breakfast, those kind of things.
Right.
A holiday that you didn't see your children, everything feels like loss. And so what we're going to be working on is remembering what makes a good parenting plan, how do we stay child-centered, and how to keep away from those feelings of possessiveness and competition, that struggle over, I want the kids, no, I want the kids, in a way that says, we have our kids, we're going to share them in the best way possible so that they have a good experience. I want to remember, leaving a relationship, leaving an intimate partnership, a marriage, doesn't mean that parents want to leave their children. And sometimes that gets coupled together, right? You know what I mean? Where it's like, okay, you left the family. It's like, no, I left our relationship. I didn't leave my kids. I didn't leave their sense of family. So we're going to help you, the viewers, to kind of walk through that and understand how to wrestle with those feelings in a way that we protect kids and write a strong child-centered parenting plan.
Right, and I think so many times it feels unnatural for the clients I'm working with to think that they've got to sit down and create a schedule, whereas everything had a regular flow during in their daily life of their family. And so when we're looking at helping them craft a schedule that ideally maybe they never really have to look at again, but we're going to use that as their default backup for how they are going to share these children across 2 homes. We have to remember, first and foremost, we do have a document that we are creating with legal implications.
Exactly.
And so
yeah.
With those legal implications, what I want to remind everyone about, again, obviously, is you want to make sure and check with an attorney in your jurisdiction to find out the specific needs that apply to the parenting plans that have been adopted by your local courts. Because, of course, when we're giving suggestions on how to craft your parenting plan, we want to make sure that it's something that your own jurisdiction will approve of. But having said that, we really do have universal concepts with how we want to move forward and help you move forward. We want to make sure that we start getting away from that C word, custody, because it seems to imply to me that, your kids are not in jail. So
they're in custody with one parent and they're protected and they're sort of, circled in. It's like ownership.
Right.
Yeah.
And so many jurisdictions now are getting away from that word. And what we're really looking at is using a term, shared residential time or residential time. We're also getting away from the word visitation.
Right. You don't visit with a parent. Parents take care of you. You visit with an aunt, you visit with a friend, but parents take care of you.
Right. So what we're really trying to do in that parenting plan that you're going to be crafting is creating a document that can become your default, in a sense, when you may have disagreements on what your schedule would be. But just by virtue of going through the exercise of creating a parenting plan, you are helping yourself define with your co-parent what all these different things can look like as you move forward with your children. Because what children benefit from most, right, is consistency and predictability and lack of conflict. So the more we can spell these things out in advance, the more durable your parenting plan is going to be, and the better you're going to be able to launch yourself into this new relationship.
Like any new way of being, this is a way of building rhythms and practices that allow the family to take and make new adjustments, right?
Right.
And at the front end, it's very, very bumpy. The idea that I won't see my kids for 2 nights, that's crazy. That's never happened before unless I was going with my sisters on a long weekend. But now it's like, okay, I'm used to, or I'm getting used to the idea that there are these rhythms. Our children get used to the rhythms, they get used to how transitions work, and pretty soon, guess what? After a year or two, and yes, it may take that year or two to build those new rhythms, we're actually all settled in. And what I thought was going to feel horrible doesn't feel horrible at all.
Right.
We've just found new patterns for our transition family.
So let's talk about developing residential schedules with respect to the various steps and stages we want to consider, because it's oftentimes different if we want to craft something unique to each age of the children, perhaps in a multi-child household. So how do we address those issues?
Perfect. Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that there are often tiers and steps, particularly at the front end. So in other words, right when your children are adjusting to 2 homes, we might use a month or 6 weeks to kind of ramp up into whatever that initial residential schedule is. The less precipitous, the less ruptured it feels. So if one parent is moving out, maybe there are play dates in that new home, or there's a Saturday night sleepover before we actually drop into what might ultimately be the first tier of a residential schedule. Another important concept, residential schedules are often built in tiers, because what's appropriate for my 3-year-old will be very different than what's appropriate when she's 7, and certainly again when she's 12. So when I'm building a schedule, although I'm going to be writing a parenting plan that lasts until age 18, in there I might have developmental steps or tiers where that schedule actually changes.
You know, and I think what's also important that I often advise my clients to do is practice some of these schedules as you're formulating them. Just because you have to ultimately have what you're hoping is going to be the schedule in your parenting plan doesn't mean that you can't take some time to try it on for size. I know you call that training wheels, but I'll often say, well, here, if you've worked out a certain idea, why don't we try 6 weeks or 8 weeks of this?
Correct.
And see what feels good, maybe what's not working, and let's come back and make some adjustments. So by the time you're ready to actually get that parenting plan signed off on by the court, you've already gotten yourself well into something that you believe is going to be doable for your family and sustainable.
That's so wonderful, because part of what we want for kids is we want them to have the experience of building confidence, right?
Right.
And so as we walk them through and work with them through understanding how a residential schedule works, they build confidence in themselves and competence in the skills needed to successfully navigate their new 2-home family. So very, very good point about practicing. So if we talk about special considerations, let's talk about infants to age 3. I mentioned this in our first video, and I want to touch on it again. A baby is not a football. So if you are trying to craft a parenting plan for a very, very young child, particularly an infant, you're going to want to work with someone, your pediatrician, a psychiatric nurse practitioner who understands infant mental health, because you know what we build for our children in this first 3 years, they're going to live with for the rest of their lives. The better we are at understanding breastfeeding and that implication, the better we are at understanding bonding. Again, bonding with multiple adults. There is no reason an infant cannot be primarily bonded to both parents or even 3 people. Sometimes there's a grandparent involved. But we want to understand how it works, and how self-soothing works, and how predictability of rhythms work, and how crucial those are to the mental health and overall resilience of that infant. So that's one category we want to be really careful about.
I want to say something about the 0 to 3 years old children as well. And as some clients pointed out to me, which I hadn't thought of before, is that those children pretty much will never remember their parents living together.
Correct.
So when you're structuring that schedule, it's something to keep in mind that this is all they're ever going to know, two separate households among both parents. So does that play into it in your mind? Is there something you can say about that?
Definitely. In fact, in that very first, since we were talking about tiers, in that very first 0 to 3 months, it's likely that the infant isn't necessarily changing households. Now that doesn't mean that both parents aren't caring for that baby, maybe even every day, certainly every other day, but that there's not necessarily a household change there, because that predictability and those rhythms and being comfortable in their own pen or whatever is important. But as we start building in separate residential time, you're absolutely right that that sense of two homes is just an expanded sense of home. And we help children develop that sense of security, right? Security, secure base, self-soothing, rhythms, predictability, both parents. That's what we're looking for in that very, very young age group. What about high schoolers? You mentioned them a few minutes ago.
It's really important for parents to consider all the different factors that teenagers encounter in their daily life. And that is friends, their social circles, their extracurricular activities, their school activities, and what the relationship is with respect to each of the parents and how they are learning to separate themselves from their parents. I think you call that individuation, right?
Right.
Big fancy word for I want to be myself now and I don't want to be attached at the hip to my parents. And so that is something that oftentimes we want to get more creative about, how to structure a parenting plan that incorporates these teenagers without restricting their growth and development as a teenager.
Correct. So I want to comment a little bit about that, because oftentimes we might in one family have school-age children, right? You might have school-age children and a teen or a budding teen. And we'd actually want to try and keep siblings on a similar rhythm. So I don't want to imply in some way that we might have, Matt, our 15-year-old, doing something very different than Sarah and Madeline, the two girls, ages 8 and 10. So here's the deal. Early adolescents still very much need parents. And just like I say, at what age would you let your child set their own curfew?
Right.
So let me ask you that. At what age would you let your child set their own curfew?
25.
25, right? Most parents look at me like that is the most ridiculous question when they go to college or when they're out of high school, when they're living on their own, and I say absolutely. And that's when they should determine their residential schedule. So remember that you and your co-parent still are the executive team of your family. So although in your jurisdiction, your 13, 14, or 15-year-old may have a say, I would definitely want to know that before I even offered that up as a possibility. My experience teaches me when two co-parents come together and say, hey, your mom and I, your dad and I have figured out a residential schedule for you and for your siblings, and this is how it's going to work. Believe it or not, most of the time they just get on the team. Now, there are some exceptions, and our really late adolescents, our 16, 17, 18-year-olds, our juniors, seniors in high school, they're kind of like, I don't need parents anyway, so I need less parents in particular and less back and forth. So keeping all of this in mind as you build your residential schedule and you talk with your kids about that, our older teens do better with less transitions, and at the same time, they need us both as much as they've ever need us. Even if it's just to drive you to the mall or get you to football practice, they still need both parents in the saddle with them as they prepare to launch for college.
I really love that term you use, the rhythm, and I know another term you use is the river, right? And we're going to get into that in a minute. And we've been talking about birth to 3 and some of the older kids and families, and we really haven't mentioned yet anything about really preschool on up to probably high school and that wide gap in between. Is there anything you want to say about that right now?
I do. Let's go ahead and before we actually get into shared parenting, what I do want to say is one more thing, which is as parents sit down to do this, as co-parents sit down, what if they can't even get close to what they think is a good residential schedule?
Well, obviously, we want to go back to some of the parameters we outlined in our first video, which is what helps create a good divorce in the first place, or a good separation.
For kids.
For kids,
Yeah.
right. And what is kind of that umbrella that you can hold yourself under with respect to what you'd like to see, how you like to see your family redefined on the other side of the process. And so if you start there with what your goals are, I think some of the specifics will begin to come into play better. But of course, as we said in the first video as well, get some outside help. Get a facilitator or a mediator or a family therapist or a child specialist, and have some outside input to help you.
Right.
And sometimes child specialists can also bring in the voice of the child.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. That person can actually meet with your kids. And rather than parents trying to interview kids and say, well, what do you want? And what do you want? Have that neutral third party who skillfully knows how to address these issues with kids, and then bring that back to you and your co-parent, oftentimes with your divorce coach, so that you get good information about what kids need. And then last but not least, let's just review. What's good for kids: strong and engaged relationship with both parents, right?
Right.
Rhythms, predictability, and secure home bases. A home with each parent. So a home with you and a home with you. We want to maximize parent time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the lenses that we want to look through. What can we do that maximizes strong, engaged relationships with both parents, good communication, integration across both homes, and healthy, thriving kids?
Right.